Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends of the Villa Vigoni, the German-Italian Center for the European Dialogue. My name is Christiane Liermann. I am Secretary General of this German-Italian institution. It is for the Villa Vigoni a great pleasure and honor to host this conference. As you know, the Villa Vigoni is a unique organization in Europe since it is paritatical German-Italian. That means the governments of both countries, Italy and Germany, contribute together to sponsor this institution. The property of the Villa Vigoni is German, but the Federal Republic offers this beautiful real estate on the Lake of Como to the German-Italian Association Villa Vigoni so that it may accomplish its mission. That is, the mission is to deepen the German-Italian relationship in a European perspective. And this European perspective is also exactly the focus of our new program that has the title Vigonomics. Vigonomics are talks on the euro and on the European monetary and financial situation now and in the future. We thank so much Fabio Colasanti, dear friend of the Villa Vigoni, who is the very best conductor of these Vigonomic talks. And we do thank you so much, dear Mateusz Szczurek and dear Daniel Gros, for participating with your immense competence and for giving us an idea of the new European financial instruments to overcome the dramatic crisis. So thank you again. This is a great opportunity for Villa Vigoni, and the floor is yours.
Let's move on to this seminar, which is on the annual report of the European Fiscal Board, and especially on its recommendations for the reform of the European fiscal rules. We are very happy to have with us Mateusz Szczurek, who's a member of the European Fiscal Board. He will also tell us something a little bit later about the role and the purpose of this group. And being a member of the Fiscal Board, he is one of the authors of the report that we shall be discussing. Mateusz, besides being a member of the European Fiscal Board, is a professor at the University of Warsaw, and is also an associate director, regional lead economist at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. But Mateusz was also the Polish finance minister in two governments from 2013 to 2015. And he must have been very good in his job because he received a couple of awards. In particular, he was declared by the magazine The Banker, I believe, the best European finance minister of 2015. So, congratulations. Daniel Gros.
Well, it was not good enough to be re-elected, I'm afraid.
That's a good point. Daniel Gros is an extremely well-known person in Brussels. He's a pillar of the economic community in the Brussels bubble. He was, until a few days ago, the director of SEPS. He has held this position for 20 years, and he has done so many other things. He has been teaching in universities. He has advised practically all the European institutions at one time or another. And he's the author of an incredibly long series of publications. In fact, I've seen on his CV that he has even stopped counting them. Daniel is also a very good European. He's German, as you know, but he obtained his first economics degree from the University of Rome. And strange coincidence, both Daniel and I graduated from this university, and we prepared our final dissertation under the supervision of the same professor, Federico Caffè. So we have two extremely qualified speakers to discuss our subject matter. The European Fiscal Board presented its first proposals for the reform of the European fiscal rules already in the 2018 report. They reviewed them in 2019. They made an important contribution in the July 2020 report and re-examined their proposals in the light of the current crisis in the report that we'll be discussing today. Daniel has written extensively about the European fiscal rules on many occasions, and of course, he has re-examined them various times after the outbreak of the COVID recession. So we can start. Mateusz, the floor is yours. As I mentioned before, could you start by saying something on the purpose and the role of the European Fiscal Board? Please.
The European Fiscal Board is the only born child of the 5 presidents report, and not particularly light child. And in my last ECOFIN meeting, I remember discussing creation of this body. I admit I was not particularly enthusiastic about it, and I ended up sitting in it. European Fiscal Board advises the European Commission on the application of the EU fiscal rules, especially regarding its horizontal nature, so that same rules apply for every country.
And okay, we advise on the appropriate fiscal stance for the euro area as a whole, which is a commendable idea, but with little practical consequences, as fiscal policy is mostly a sum of individual member states' policies. And we also provide an ad hoc advice to the President of the Commission. And as part of this, okay, the head, the chief, the chair of the European Fiscal Board is Niels Stigesen, who is even longer in the European game than Daniel, in this respect, being also a past member of the Delors Committee. And I have now also 3 other colleagues, all university professors. So by now I'm the only person that was on the receiving end of the EU fiscal rules, and with sort of practical experience of how they worked and how, for example, how to explain them to my prime minister, which is also an interesting experience. And as an ad hoc request last year, we were asked to evaluate how EU fiscal rules worked so far in the past decades, especially during the financial crisis and in the aftermath. And we published a lengthy report trying to answer the questions whether the EU fiscal rules ensured long-term sustainability of public finances, if they allowed counter-cyclical economic stabilization, or whether they helped to improve the quality of public finances, and what can be done about it if they didn't. And there are many good things that can be said about the EU fiscal rules, but not everything worked as expected in our view. First of all, the high debt ratios of the indebted countries were not sufficiently reduced. It looked like they worked for a group of countries, but not all of them. In particular, they didn't really for the very high debt countries. The national fiscal policies ended up too often pro-cyclical, and various flexibilities introduced in the rules have not prevented cutbacks in public investments. And so that these were our conclusions of the evaluation, there were a number of difficulties in implementation, which are also important. Things like complex and opaque rules based often on unobservable indicators. These complexities sometimes hide inadequacy and allow for pretending that the rules are met, but sometimes they're not. In spirit, they're not really. But still, deviations often remain. Sanctions prove very difficult to enforce. Medium-term planning is missing. Also, planned adjustment is typically backloaded. And finally, political considerations often interfere with economic assessment. It's all a bit mixed up in the way the Commission assesses whether the country meets the fiscal rules or not. And we proposed, and I'm talking about this previous report because the current one refers to it. We proposed a number of reforms, and the key elements can be summarized as this. First of all, get rid of all the superfluous rules that overlap and allow for sometimes too much flexibility and make the whole system extremely messy. So instead, let's just have one debt anchor, one operational target, and that is a net primary expenditure growth rule, and one escape clause activated on the basis of independent economic assessment. And these are the simple things, and that would require getting rid of many embellishments. We nevertheless did propose some embellishments to that simple system, and that is a limited golden rule, a slightly different treatment of investment in the fiscal rules. Also, changes to the way the whole system operates. So we would like to see a full-time president of the Eurogroup. Now this function is carried by one of the members of the Eurogroup or one of the ministers. The reverse qualified majority voting in the application of the fiscal rules, it didn't really work that well. And it would be good to abolish it because it results in mixing the political and technocratic function of the Commission. Also, access to future common fiscal capacity, if it's ever created, could be made conditional compliance with the fiscal rules. And in the longer run, this is what we wrote last year, it would be good to have a potential differentiation in country-specific fiscal targets. This one debt anchor could be made country-specific. And has the current crisis made this analysis irrelevant? No. In our view, if anything, it confirmed our worries about how the system functioned, at least the application of the rules in 2019 confirmed many of the problems that we've been pointing to. And also, it made some of the reforms more pressing. And let me come back to this in a second. So the COVID-19 crisis and the run-up to it underscored the three missing elements in the EMU architecture. What is missing is a genuine and permanent central fiscal capacity. The fiscal rules will need to be reformed, preferably in the way that we proposed. Also, a protection mechanism for growth-enhancing public government investments would be nice to have. And don't get me wrong, the new generation EU and SURE are very commendable policy responses to this at the European level. I hope the Recovery and Resilience Facility will be operational as soon as possible, and I do hope that a system similar to that will be made permanent at some stage, but it's not there yet, and it's very much needed. But I mentioned the last point. or rather the second point here, the Reformed Stability and Growth Pact, there's been discussions about this going on, but it was never a priority. I think this should become a priority now, and this reformed fiscal framework should be discussed and preferably agreed upon before the deactivation of the general escape clause that we are now experiencing. The fiscal rules are not operational in 2020. The governments do whatever they can to contain the COVID crisis, not worrying about the fiscal statistics, and rightly so. But at the same time, at some stage, the rules will be reinstated. And two problems that we have with it is that, one, we don't know when exactly this is going to happen. It would be nice to have a system that would make it clearer to the policymakers when the rules will be back and operational. One possible mechanism could be that we back to normal when GDP level returns to the pre-2020 levels, 2019, for example. Level of GDP, not growth, because growth is much easier to achieve in current circumstances than rebuilding of the lost output. And the second thing is, what exactly are we returning to? Because the world, the fiscal landscape of the European Union will be different after COVID. It's already different. And some of the rules that we pretended operated prior to 2019 will make little sense post 2020. Probably the best example of that is the question of the debt reduction target. Every high debt country in the European Union is supposed to reduce its debts to GDP by 1/20th of the distance to the 60% anchor target written in the Maastricht Treaty. It was already extremely difficult to achieve for high debt countries experiencing low nominal growth. Italy is the best example of that. So there were various ways of ignoring non-compliance there. It was okay if the country met the structural deficit target, but with debt to GDP exceeding 150%, the whole exercise becomes a farce. And either you can make the whole rule totally irrelevant and the 60% debt to GDP limit just as good as non-existent, or we can take it seriously, which in the recovery phase will be even worse. And I think both of these eventualities would be damaging and wrong in current circumstances. So one of the subjects of the final chapter, proposing in more detail how the new system could work, concerns exactly this: what to do with the 60% debt to GDP anchor, which is at the base of the renewed Reform, Stability and Growth Pact. And our idea is to make it country-specific, to make it more realistic, in order to preserve its existence and its force, its power. There is no way Italy could run 5% plus primary surplus for the next 20 years in order to fulfill the 60% debt to GDP reduction requirement. Instead, what we propose is to make the 20 years, prolong the 20 years to a much longer horizon, reducing the requirement to cut debt to GDP, but at the same time keeping the requirement to cut at all and to stabilize debt in place. This is the equivalent of effectively of setting a different target than 60%. And our idea is to make it country specific, possibly through even a political bargaining, and with this target at the same time as firmly embedded in local, so country legislation or European legislation. The other two elements that we discuss is central fiscal capacity, and new generation EU would be fantastic to have, and it meets a number of requirements of a good central fiscal capacity that we were thinking of. There are some other ideas for a reformed EU budget, introducing a compartment, sort of an envelope that is increased by the country itself and reserved for public investment. If it's not used, then it goes back to the general pool. And investment protection mechanism that excludes parts of the public investment from EU fiscal limits, in particular spending limit, which we believe could be helpful to counterbalance the secular trend that we see. A secular trend where less and less, a smaller and smaller share of public spending is devoted to public investment, and that is a result of a number of reasons, sometimes not even related to fiscal rules, things like environmental requirements, political considerations, missing voter mechanism, where it's and general higher political risks of spending public money on investments compared to redistribution, for example. So some second best solution of supporting these investments would be welcome. Let me end the introduction here, and I'm very curious about Daniel's take on these ideas.
Thanks, Mateusz. Daniel.
Yes, many thanks for this very good and comprehensive presentation. Maybe it's a good thing I'm not part of the council. I already told Niels Stuyvesant, who's a good friend of mine, that we had written a book together in the 1990s on European monetary integration, in which we have a chapter on the need for fiscal rules. And somehow he seems to have gone astray in this particular juncture. Now, in making my comments, let me concentrate on two issues. One is the pact itself, its concentration on debt, and why that might or might not be important at this particular juncture. Now, the first point I would make, and that's very general, is that if there's one lesson we should have learned from two crises occurring within 10 years when they were supposed to occur 100 years apart, that maybe what we call fat tails are more important than we think. So the likelihood of very adverse economic scenarios cannot be dismissed. And if I would like to combine that with a very simple proposition, which is that the cost of public debt is, as the economists say, convex. Meaning if you have double the debt level of another country, the potential cost is not twice as much, but more than twice as much, right? Many of our economic models imply that. Now, if you put the two things together, that the outcome, that the adverse shocks maybe are more likely than we thought beforehand, and that the cost of public debt is convex, this would mean naturally that we should be even more concerned about high public debt levels. Right? To make it plastic, if Italy gets into the next crisis with a debt level of 160% of GDP, then that will be the end of it, right? The Germans right now are sitting happily there with their 60%. They can do basically whatever they want. So it pays to have a low debt level. That is something, not just something academic, but it's very concrete for policymakers. So my first point would be we should be very concerned about debt levels, perhaps even more than before. How quickly should we get them down to some target, and should that target be different for different countries? There, I would make two arguments. It's obvious that if we take Italy's past performance and then apply the famous rule R minus G, right? What's the difference between the interest rate and the growth rate? Italy is worse off than Germany. But past performance, as they say, is no guarantee for the future. The Germans are sitting pretty now. They have had a good 2 decades. During the 1990s, they were the 6th man of Europe. Who knows whether the future is different? And as I said, take Italy or Spain or something other, right? Just take past performance and say, okay, if we assume that to be holding for the future, then of course, Italian debt level should actually be lower than that of Germany. The sustainable target debt level for Italy should be lower than for Germany. And even if you give Italy a slower degree of convergence, it would still have to do much more, maybe as much as under the old rules. So I think in practical policy making, having differentiated targets brings us back to the old problem that we have somehow to estimate potential growth that we have to do for targeting or for having a target for debt levels. We would also have to have it for your target of primary expenditure, because your target growth rate for primary expenditure is again related to some idea of what's the potential growth rate of the country. So we're always back to square one on this one. And finally, again, at the macroeconomic level, I would really suggest that the idea that we put our rules again into operation only when the output gap has been eliminated betrays, let's say, thinking that this time is the same as last time. That we have an economy-wide shock to demand, and until that has been remedied, we need support from fiscal policy. Now, I would say that this time is different in the sense that right now we have a sectoral recession. The sector of restaurants, travel, tourism might not be back on full capacity for a very long time. But if most of the rest of the economy is back on stream, there's actually no reason to provide fiscal support in the sense of demand management. Yes, you can provide income support for the sectors which are lagging, but income support for in the sense of aggregate demand management doesn't make sense at this point. And therefore, I think all of our rules of linking somehow the desirable deficit to the output gap should go out of the window, and we should focus on debt, even if there's still some output gap, some sectoral output gap which remains. So this is my broad take on the macroeconomic impact. Now, let me come, if you want, Fabio, to investment, or we can start the discussion here.
I would like to ask both of you a question, because we are having this discussion not just for the benefit of specialists, but also of people who are not as introduced as inside these discussions. One thing that I would like to ask both of you is that there is a widespread agreement in all the contributions that I've seen on this debate since 2017, 2019, no one has denied the necessity of fiscal rules. Not even the European Fiscal Board. The European Fiscal Board in its report say that fiscal rules are necessary. The question is, how should they be adapted to be easier to understand, more effective? But one point that I would like to ask you if you agree to confirm for the benefit of our viewers is that everybody agrees that the monetary union needs to function a set of fiscal rules that tries to keep a lid on deficits and debt. Do you agree with this statement?
Yes.
Yes, I certainly agree, and I was actually quite surprised by Daniel's assessment of the change that happened to Neil's approach. No, I mean, our proposals are there exactly to protect the fiscal rules. And I don't think, Pamio, you're right, that everybody agrees that we need them. I see voices, two types of voices. One is that let's replace numerical rules with standards. That's Olivier Blanchard's idea in the paper that he co-authored recently, and the other group, and I think this is the problem we're trying to resolve, is that, well, the rules as they stand become so abstract that they're irrelevant. They're either too ambitious, so we just have to avoid them or pretend to fulfill them, but not really. Or they're so messy that it's impossible to tell whether we are meeting them or not. So it's not like the European Fiscal Board is against the rules. On the contrary, we want the rules to matter. We want the rules to have political relevance, and it's a dynamic process. This is something. It's a constant game to reinvent, to close the loopholes, and to keep them relevant. Because otherwise, even this jump in debt to GDP could result in them becoming just ignored by most policymakers.
Daniel?
As I said, I think the rules are necessary. If there's one change, I would put even more emphasis on debt reductions. And I think that should be the key focus.
I have also the impression that there is agreement, Daniel, with what you said about the fact that the output gap that is at the basis of the adjustments made to the fiscal rules when they were made more intelligent in 2011, 2012, that the output gap now is not a useful measure to guide the stance of economic policy. You have explained that very well in one of your publications. I think you are quite right. And I believe that the Fiscal Board is also not supporting the continued use of potential growth, output gap, or measures like this, which in any case, even in normal times, are very difficult to understand. Mateusz, is that correct?
That is partially correct. The current system of judging the fiscal policy using structural deficit, which is based on output gap and potential output calculations, is a nightmare. And it's a nightmare I'm talking about, from sort of also personal experience. It's absolutely impossible to explain your targets to the general public, and it takes an extraordinary prime minister to understand what you're trying to achieve. And even then, given the volatility and uncertainty and revisions of the estimates, you stop having faith in the indicator very quickly yourself. So it's an uphill struggle. And But that said, there is a slight difference between output gap as the basis for policy making and potential output growth as the basis of policy making. Because then the errors are much smaller, volatility is less. You can even base this on a very simple, moving average indicator for the, getting rid of complicated machinery behind it on one hand, but gaining simplicity and ability to explain what you're doing at the same time. So our fiscal rule that we're proposing is that unless you generate more taxes, growth of your spending should not exceed the average growth that the country is achieving over the medium term. And of course, you'll make mistakes. The crisis like these will change these things. But the average is simple to understand, and errors in estimating potential growth are much smaller than the errors concerning potential output.
Daniel?
I don't disagree with the fact that if one could reliably estimate potential growth rates, it would make sense to have this rule. I myself advocated it for some time, but then I had to look how they work in the reality. And I found that actually the errors you have are very similar to the errors you have in estimating the output gap. It is just that they accumulate over time. So the danger of this expenditure rule is that you apply it for 2 or 3 years. Then, as you say, new data comes in and you revise your estimate of the output gap. Of the potential growth rate, excuse me. And then suddenly everything you said in the past now looks different. Unavoidable with this kind of rule, as it was unavoidable with the output gap. I don't think the problems there are much different, but it's also, if you want, not much worse from an output gap based approach.
Can I go back to another point where you appear to have a difference, but I'm not so sure that the difference is so big? You both recognize the need for an anchor for public debt, but the fiscal board suggests a differentiated target, whereas you, Daniel, seem more or less to think that maybe the present rules more or less are adequate. In the July report of the fiscal board, you even had a chart with a matrix of different combination of targets, growth rates, rates of interest that one might obtain. And essentially your point was, Mateusz, that, as you said, you cannot expect too high a primary surplus from certain countries for too long, and so you should have a sort of modulation. Is this the disagreement between the two of you, Mateusz and then Daniel?
Let me mention why, first defend the beauty of the 60%. I mean, first of all, it's in the, it's not quite in the treaty, but almost as good as in the treaty. So it's extremely difficult to change. Secondly, it's embedded in people's minds. When you ask someone on the street, what are the EU fiscal rules? If you get any answer at all, you'll get 3% and 60%. So 3% deficit and 60% debt as the target. So at least you don't need to teach anyone about its existence. And it matters also for policymaking. However, I am increasingly concerned with the fact that it's so far away that it's being simply ignored. And I do believe in the debt anchor as a basis for fiscal policy. I think the fact that you do have an anchor that holds is more important than where exactly this anchor is placed on the surface. So I would rather trade the solidity and whatever rocky bed for the anchor in the medium term, and prefer to have that instead of an anchor which is cemented in place, but with a rope that is completely floppy and is made of elastic. And this is what we're having, and this is what we will have even more after COVID. And that's the reason. There's another, if I may, there's another argument which we put in our assessment report last year that is, I agree, probably too far-reaching for the current state of affairs. How about making this all political? And in every 7 years to agree for the debt reduction, or rather debt target for every country in Europe, which we would make symmetric. So being Estonia, let's not, or rather, since this is Villa Vigoni, so maybe Germany convinces Italy to reduce Italy's debt, but at the price of promising that it would not reduce its debt, or it would keep its spending unchanged for the next 7 years, for example. This would allow for some coordination of fiscal policy that we're missing without central fiscal capacity. Again, I mean, this is probably going too far, but what we're trying to achieve is just to make the debt target operational.
Now,
Daniel?
I think the political and practical problems you run into having a differentiated debt target for different countries would probably result in a nightmare. Make it concrete. Let's take a country like Poland. Let's say 3% potential growth rate. Okay, for a country like Poland, even 90% debt with low interest rates might be, 90% debt to GDP ratio might be a good target. Then we take Italy, which has a much lower growth rate, at least if you look at the past, 1% only. So for Italy, the debt target should be 45%, right? Who's going to impose that? And on top of that, we know that what matters always is the difference between the interest rate the government pays on its debt and the growth rate of the economy. Italy pays a higher interest rate than other countries. Should that be taken into account? That would mean an even lower target debt ratio for Italy. And I would like to see the ECOFIN Council where such a decision are being taken.
Can I ask you a couple of more political questions? Daniel has just said that agreeing on certain targets, I would say agreeing on certain modifications would be a nightmare. What are your expectations? Because on the one hand, one could say, well, there is a lot of sense for saying, as the fiscal board said, let's have a revision now, so that when at the end of 2021, we will reintroduce the fiscal rules, we will have something more effective. Makes sense. But how long it will take to have a revision of the fiscal rules in a way that is effective, and perhaps should it even involve a revision of the treaties? Isn't there a risk that the very discussion about the reform of the fiscal rules leads to a situation where their reintroduction will be postponed for a long period, for too long? Mateusz?
I mean, I've watched discussions at the EU Council level, and there is very little chance of any changes being introduced soon. I believe it is sad, but we are still in a strange equilibrium where for countries that are struggling to meet the current debt targets, for example, or I've been struggling with EU fiscal rules in general. The current situation makes it even easier to explain what they've been always doing and keep on doing it. So why change the rules? Why engage in this discussion? Because they're becoming more abstract, so no one's going to blame us for not sticking to them. And at the same time, the countries that were promoting rules are rules, and we need to, that they can pretend they are as strict as ever, not allowing for any loosening of the rules. So this equilibrium results in no change, but a no change that is resulting in rules turning into a facade, which is, I think, dangerous, and which would like to avoid. Of course, I agree with these political difficulties. I mentioned that the differentiated debt targets could be made. I mean, equivalent of that is just a differentiated debt reduction speed towards the same target for every single country. If I may add one other important argument why the rules are important today and even more important now. When Maastricht was being signed, the worries were about this fiscal domination and the risk of a country that would run too high budget deficit, try to at the expense of the others. Now, we learned in early 2010s that the other types of externalities of a country running too tight a fiscal policy also has costs on others. But I think the more active engagement of the European Central Bank in the policy response to the COVID crisis, I think it makes the old arguments more valid, because the risk of free riding on loose monetary policy is increasing, and I think that these old discussions from the Maastricht era are perhaps getting more relevant. If we want to preserve low interest rates and better coordination between the European Central Bank and member states' fiscal policies.
Daniel?
I think it is very difficult to have a useful discussion about the reform of the rules at this point. We're just navigating in a fog of uncertainty, not only short term, but also medium term. The COVID crisis could lead to an extended period of low growth. And maybe after even the sectors have recovered, which have been directly hit, maybe low demand because people feel uncertain. Or maybe not. Maybe we have an acceleration as new technology is being adopted everywhere. So I would say just having now an in-depth discussion of what new rules we should have is not very useful. I would just say that putting the old rules, at least formally, back into operation should not wait until the output gap has been eliminated, but let's say until most sectors, except those directly affected by COVID, have recovered. And then we can think again usefully about demand management.
Can I ask you both a point that puzzles me a bit? It's a bit a question of analysis. In the report of the Fiscal Board, but also in other publications, for instance, at the analysis of Bruegel, there is the statement that the fiscal rules have been too restrictive in 2010, 2011. I don't remember reading that in anything written by Daniel. I have the impression that this statement is not quite correct. We certainly had restrictive budgetary policies in 2010, 2011, but that, in my view, was not due to the fiscal rules, was due to the fear coming from what was happening in Greece and from the restructuring of the Greek debt and the contagion that spread to other countries with difficult financial positions. The fiscal rules, unfortunately, so far, in my view, are not shown to have had an enormous effect on the budgetary policies. Mateusz?
Well, you could add rate hikes by the ECB that came way too early as another tightening mechanism that was in place far too early in the recovery phase. It is, of course, I mean, the market pressure was extremely important factor of austerity in the countries affected by it. No doubt about this. And it was not like it was the rules that made Greece or Spain hesitant or impossible in some cases to borrow and spend. It was the markets. But it was not just them that reduced spending very early on and cut off this demand support, in my view, prematurely. And Germany was not constrained by the market at the time. I'm not sure it was particularly constrained by the rules either. It was internal. Again, it was related to public preferences in a member country, in Germany in this case, but with severe consequences to the others. And that is the beauty and the curse of the European Union, that what you're doing in one country does matter for the others as well.
Daniel?
I think we agree that the fiscal rules themselves had very little, I was going to say, responsibility for the fiscal adjustment in both the countries which were subject to fiscal stress, so Italy and Spain. And in Germany, as you just said, Mateusz, Germany could do what it wants, right, from the financial markets perspective. Now, let me emphasize 2 points here. The first is, and that refers to what Mateusz just said, because Germany tightened, and many people think prematurely, I don't disagree, that this had a major impact on the rest of the EU. We have seen lots of estimates, and Fabio, I think, knows them very well, that the impact of a German tightening on Italy and Spain, the so-called periphery, would have been minor, second order of importance, for the simple reason that the trade relationships between these countries are not very strong. So I would object to the statement that the tightening by Germany had a major impact on the rest of the euro area. Perhaps a minor, perhaps contributing a bit to problems there, but certainly not major. on the adjustment in the periphery, one recurring argument is, they decided to reduce demand support, GDP goes down, and therefore the denominator goes down, and the and the debt to GDP ratio goes actually up, right? And this is a result you can have if you have a multiplier, short-term multiplier of 1, right? So you reduce the deficit by 1%, but GDP goes down by more 1%, and the GDP ratio goes up. That is only something which can happen in the first year. The second year already, right? You add again to the deficit and the debt level. GDP is at the same level. So this is a very short-term effect, which can be true, but it's not something which works over time. And that's why financial markets saw through that. After a while, when the fiscal adjustment took place, risk premia fell. Not immediately, not very quickly, but over time they fell. And I think a good reason for their fall was, apart from the action by the ECB, also the fact that these countries then had been or had pushed themselves on a sustainable fiscal trajectory.
I think we have come to the end of the time that we have. It's a big subject, but you have made very good contributions. Is there perhaps, Mateusz, since you are the author of the report, something that you might want to say just in one final minute? Otherwise, I would thank you both for your contributions. Mateusz?
I just wanted to thank Daniel very much for his comments, because this is, I think it's too easy and in the world of spreads tightening and very, very low rates, to lose his side of the argument. And it is important in such times to remember about these things, and remember that that debt is not totally irrelevant yet. It's going to stay with us at much elevated levels, and we will need to cope with it.
Okay, thank you to both of you.